All right, we're gonna roll. Are we rolling now? So, Steve, do you remember the first time we met?
You know, Mark, there have been so many memorable experiences since we met. It's really hard to pick out any one of them.
Oh, isn't that nice? That's what a nice thing to say. So,
and you're the sales guy.
My first time that I met you, actually, I watched a video of you that you did with a teacher or somebody interviewing you at University of Washington.
Right.
And I look at that and I said, this guy is so stiff. I'm going to freak out trying to talk to this guy because it wasn't like you today. It was you were not comfortable in that whole setting.
Right. I think I remember that interview.
Yeah. So I interviewed with Construx for this account director position. I came in, I talked to all the staff. I came back a second day, and the first interview was with you.
Okay.
And so our COO walks me down the hallway, and I'm thinking, here we go. I'm going to meet this guy. He's going to see right through the back of my head. He's going to scare the hell out of me. Mm-hmm. And I sit down. Your desk is completely clear, and there's 3 pieces of paper upside down on the desk. And so we sit, chit-chat and everything, and you said, my job is to kind of check you out for culture fit, value fit, whatever kind of stuff. Right? And so you said, everybody else has already looked at you for sales acumen. I'm not worried about that. I want to know how you fit. Mm-hmm. And you said, there's one thing on your resume that I didn't quite think was truthful. Uh-huh. And you said you mentioned all the hobbies that you liked. Running, photography, gardening, home brewing, and something else. And you said, I call crap on this because there's 5 employees here that have the same hobbies, so I'm going to test you. Uh-huh. So the next thing that happens is you turn these papers upside down, and there's 3 shrubs. Uh-huh. And I'm like, what the heck is this? And you say, what is this? I was like, oh, this is the interview. I'm going to nail this, right? So we talked about red twig
I have absolutely no memory of this.
You don't remember that?
I deny all of it.
I think you gave me the papers. I could probably find them in my office somewhere. So
it's funny. It's probably either plants I was trying to identify at the time and needed help with and thought, okay, if this guy's for real, I'll get the help I need.
That's exactly what it was, because they were on Bellevue Way in the islands, and we talked about it because I drove in and saw them, and you said, yes, that's exactly where they are. What are they?
Right.
So that was the whole...
Yeah,
so it diffused the whole thing.
I kind of remember that now. I think one of them would have been a California lilac, because I remember not knowing what that was at the time.
We just, and it just diffused the whole thing, and our relationship was beautiful from then on. So
that's right.
It was awesome.
Nothing but beautiful. Yes.
All right, let's get started. So this is Mark Griffin. I'm the Director of Customer Solutions here at Construx. We're a team of software engineering experts led by legendary author Steve McConnell. Here we believe every software team can be more successful at delivering higher levels of business value. In every episode, we talk with one of our consultants exploring a recent engagement, and we describe the issues we were faced with, how we solved them, and we have a lot of fun along the way. So let's get to it. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Today we have a very special guest here in the studio today. We actually have Steve McConnell. Steve is the CEO and Chief Software Engineer at Construx Software, where he oversees Construx training and consulting businesses. He is the author of Code Complete, which has been translated into 20 languages and is often cited as the most popular software development book of all time. He's also written best-selling books on software project management, software estimation, professional software development. 5 of his books have won awards for Best Book of the Year. His most recent book is More Effective Agile, a roadmap for software leaders. He served as editor-in-chief of IEEE Software Magazine, has been on the panel of experts of the software engineering body of knowledge, the SWEBOC project. He's the past chair of the IEEE Computer Society's Professional Activities Board, and he currently sits on the board, these computer science advisory boards for Whitman College and Seattle University. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
I am happy to be doing my first podcast.
Isn't that great? It's awesome.
First podcast with you, anyway.
So the book is doing really well, right?
The book is getting great reviews, and my writing process, I wish I could say I was surprised, but I'm not surprised because I go through so much peer review on the books. By the time the book comes out, I know that it's pretty good. Mm-hmm. And some of that is my effort, but a lot of it is the input I get from the peer reviewers. And in this case, I got a tremendous amount of peer review, and I think the book is vastly better because of all that great and really generous input from all the people who contributed review comments.
Awesome. So this particular podcast is a part of a series we're going to do with you, and we're going to talk about More Effective Agile in the book in particular. So I wanted to start off just with a general sort of meta question in this case, is that there are so many Agile books
meta
out
question
there.
Is a good software question.
There you go.
Yeah.
So many Agile books out there, tons of them. What led you to think about writing something now? I mean, your extensive researching of the current Agile practices out there, maybe the conversations you've had with Construx staff that were interesting to you. Why more effective Agile and why now?
Well, I've never been a big fan of publishing into a crowd or trying to publish a book when somebody else has already written a good book on the same topic. In this case, I think the gap in the Agile literature, which is actually kind of astonishing, is that there's almost nothing written for leaders. And so it just seemed to me that that was a gap in the Agile literature. I didn't think the world needed another Scrum book. It didn't need another Kanban book. It didn't need another book on Agile testing. I mean, there are good books on all those topics, but conspicuously missing is anything on Agile leadership. And there's lots and lots of complaints online from various Agile discussion forums and Twitter and so on about the impediment to a lot of Agile implementations being the organizational leaders. And so I think that one thing I've had good experience with over the last 15 years or so is working a lot with leaders and understanding how leaders think and understanding how they talk. And so I thought I could write a book that would speak to them in the language that they themselves use, but also describe the pluses and minuses of Agile. The other thing I think was missing in the literature was anything that really gave a balanced treatment of Agile. Most of the Agile literature is written by Agile fans.
Agilistas?
Well, you know what? Yeah, sure. Agilistas, you could describe it that way. I think that's a little
heavy-handed,
a little pejorative, but I would say that they are evangelists. I would say that some of them tend to have a fairly narrow point of view. One of the really cool things about working at Construx for the last 20 plus years has been exposure to all manner of different kinds of software development. And anybody who had a simplistic view of the software universe who spent a year working at Construx would lose that simplistic view because they would see the big, wide universe of ways that people are developing software. And so the idea that one size fits all, I don't even think you could have that thought after you had spent a year working with the variety of clients that we have.
That's a great answer. I appreciate that. So you actually, on the leadership topic, you organized the book around suggested leadership actions with a bunch of key principles. And we thought about how do we structure these podcasts, and I guess the way we arrived at an answer was to think about the way you put these things at the end of every chapter that are these key principles.
Right.
And so we're going to explore 4 today, hopefully get to 4, and many more in the podcast to come. So when you structured these things, you put them using the phrases inspect and adopt,
right,
which is really the first and maybe the most important principle that we've put out there. And we noticed you ripped off our podcast name, but we'll look the other way for that. So
yeah, I think you might be confused about the sequence there, but it's fine.
I always mess that up. Okay. So inspect and adapt has its origins with the so-called OODA model, right? That came from the Air Force. Maybe you can tell a little bit about that story.
Well, I don't know that inspect and adapt really has its origins in the OODA model. In the book, I present the two in tandem. I think inspect and adapt actually literally originated in the PDCA world, the Plan, Do, Check, Act,
the Deming
and Stewart world.
Right.
But I think that for whatever reason, I think when people think about PDCA, if you really understand PDCA deeply, I don't think it ends up being a static exercise. It ends up being a very dynamic exercise. But on the ground, it just doesn't seem to play out that way. And in the reviewer draft of the book, I had a discussion of PDCA that I ended up taking out. It's not in the final book.
Mm-hmm.
So in the final book, I have a discussion of the OODA, the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, that was discovered by Colonel John Boyd. And whereas I don't think the phrase inspect and adapt comes up in OODA per se, to me, I think that inspect and adapt is a useful shorthand for the same set of ideas or the key set of ideas in OODA, which is literally what it says: inspect and adapt. Pay attention to what's going on, evaluate what's the importance of it, whether it's working, whether it's not, and then make appropriate adaptations based on what you've inspected. And I think Agile in a nutshell significantly, I think, could be summarized, maybe not in its entirety, but largely just by saying inspect and adapt. And many of the key principles in Agile could be inferred from that one principle of inspect and adapt. For example, why do we need short iterations? Well, short iterations give us more frequent opportunities to inspect and adapt. If we're doing
faster.
Yeah, if we're doing 6-month development cycles, then we have our big opportunity to inspect and adapt only every 6 months. If we're doing biweekly development cycles, then we've got an opportunity to do a large-scale inspect and adapt every 2 weeks. So I think the idea of Agile being an empirical activity where we're really going to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. And we at Construx often use the phrase ground truth to describe the gap between the theory and
Absolutely.
what's actually happening. And so inspect and adapt invokes that idea of ground truth and empiricism as well. And I could go on at length about how it implies many of the other key principles in the book, but I think that's probably enough to get the idea.
Buy the book. So, yeah, I mean, Agile is an empirical approach. I mean, I think that's a strong message to drive home. So things like if you talk about Scrum adoption as a particular variety of Agile, right? Practices like sprint retrospectives give the team that ability.
Right.
You're talking more about the leadership conversations, looking at inspect and adapt, right?
I think it applies at both levels. At the leader level, there definitely is an opportunity for leaders to inspect and adapt in terms of their own conduct, their own modeling of Agile principles, and how they see the implementation of Agile going. They also, of course, have the opportunity to emphasize that as a key part of Agile to their teams. So make sure that their teams are inspecting and adapting. And really what we don't want in Agile, at least not on an ongoing, sustaining basis, is we don't want slavish devotion to what somebody read in a book about how a particular technique should be adopted. In general, I think the crawl, walk, run approach makes sense, and it makes sense for beginners to adopt practices by the book. Early on, of course, most people are beginners, the vast majority are, and so adopting practice like Scrum by the book is, in fact, in my view, the recommended approach. But once you get the basics down and institutionalized and you're working with them, at that point, moving to an inspect and adapt posture becomes important. I think in my mind, one of the gaps in the Scrum literature is the idea that most of the Scrum books stop once you get past the initial implementation and you're implementing the textbook version of Scrum with high fidelity. Really, in our experience at Construx, the mileage you get from Scrum, you get mileage from a textbook adoption, and it's often far better than what you were doing before. But the real mileage comes from applying inspect and adapt against that stable background of a disciplined Scrum implementation. And once you start doing that, the opportunity for improvement is just enormous.
How do you get leaders, or maybe in particular young leaders, to resist, I'm going to use the word meddling. How do you get them to resist meddling too much in team dynamics in the context of inspect and adapt? Is that something that light touch review, external view kind of stuff, and stay away from having to actually push hard on the team? Or how do you make that balance work?
I think the way that most organizations prevent young leaders from meddling is by overloading them to such a degree that they don't have time to meddle. But I also think that most young leaders, if they're going to meddle, they tend to come from technology backgrounds, and particularly developer backgrounds. The meddling tends to be more on technical practices, design decisions, that kind of thing. Maybe less so on process decisions like how Scrum is implemented. But I just think that's part of the growth of any leader, is learning how to lead and what actions are appropriate and what level of detail to get into. There's a difference between delegation and abdication, and the distinction's not always clear. And
right.
I think any leader knows that they should be delegating, but you also have to delegate in a way that keeps you in the loop and make sure that the team knows that you're paying attention and that you're available as a resource if the team needs you. Later in the book, I talk about the notion of commander's intent.
We'll talk about that, sure.
And so we'll get into that in a later discussion, I guess. But I just think that's part of the growth of a leader is, and I think most people probably need to learn some of those lessons the hard way. They stick their fingers in a little bit too much sometimes, and then they see the response from the team and learn to back off, and then they back off too far and they see that response from the team, and so really I think the role of the leader in inspect and adapt is what I said a couple minutes ago, which is applying inspect and adapt to your leadership activities, and then also just ensuring that the team is applying
Right.
inspect and adapt. That doesn't mean the leader goes in and double checks every instance of the team inspecting and adapting and corrects them, so to speak.
Right.
It's just more the leader ensures that that activity is actually ongoing. In some organizations, the role of the leader is to make sure the team knows it has permission to spend the time on the inspect and adapt
Right.
activity. In a lot of organizations, there's so much urgency on getting the tasks done that the teams, even though no one is telling the teams that they shouldn't take the time to engage in sprint retrospectives or whatnot, they feel that that's the case because they're under so much pressure.
Right.
And so the leader's job in that case is essentially to pry open some room for the team to be reflective about their experiences and give themselves an opportunity to improve.
That's a great way of saying it. You know, we're 20 years in from the Agile Manifesto, so there's a good probability that a lot of folks in leadership positions actually came from some kind of an Agile background when in their positions of leadership now. So maybe that helps. There's some empathy because they maybe perhaps were a team member and now they kind of think about how they're going to treat their own teams.
I think it's a double-edged sword. So yes, I think that's the case, and I think it's a double-edged sword. If you think about the chronology, in the first 10 years of Agile, I think there were a lot of really ineffective Agile implementations. That was when the industry as a whole was going down a lot of dead-end paths that really didn't amount to anything. In that time frame, we were working with companies. We had several instances of companies that had banned the use of Agile practices and, in fact, had banned the use of the word
Yep.
Agile and the word Scrum. And I think that was indicative of some misguided or maybe just not very well developed yet attempts at Agile development. You know, the world today is a different place than it was 15 or 20 years ago. Agile practices, some of them anyway, are way better defined today than they were at that time.
Absolutely.
So I think if the leader got their experience 10 years ago, their experience could actually have been with ineffective versions of these practices. They might actually have an undue bias against Agile because they had experiences that were maybe average at the time but not great overall. But this is always the issue with leaders in technology organizations. you get out of date. You know, you're out of date on the technology, you're out of date on the practices, and some leaders work really hard to keep up to date, and certainly that was one of the goals of the book, was to give an update for leaders who got their exposure to Agile 10 or 20
Perfect.
years ago and might have been well-read 15 years ago, but really haven't updated their knowledge since then.
Well said. So this kind of is a good segue into the second principle we want to talk about. We've been talking about Scrum already as an Agile practice, and we have worked a lot with clients over the years who ask us, how do we get started, or we tried bits and pieces and it's not working like the In-Flight magazine said it was supposed to work. And so that brings us to something that one of our prior podcast guests, John Clifford, talked about, which is sort of, do you pass the Agile test? And for a leader to make a change towards Agile practices, you recommend another key principle, and that is start with Scrum.
Yep.
Right? So why don't you expand a little bit on that?
Well, you have to start somewhere, and it makes sense, I think, to start in an area that works pretty well most of the time for most organizations, and that actually addresses the area where organizations tend to have problems. So if you look at work that involves one or two people, so you could kind of call that teamwork, but a lot of it's more just individuals working in parallel. That work, there's always a challenge of prioritizing and managing the flow, but that work doesn't tend to be super challenging.
Right.
Organizations really start running into challenges when they start doing work in teams, and especially as the teams get above a size of 2 or 3 people. And so, and you can't really start with the hardest problem. So if you've got a project with 150 people on it, and you want to start there, that would really be starting with the hardest problem. So Scrum, I think, has a number of advantages that make it suitable as a place to start. Number one, I think there's actually at this point tons of industry experience with it. So although the problems aren't always addressed in lots of the books that have written or articles or blog articles that have been written about it, I think as a whole we have pretty good insight into where the stumbling blocks are. Secondly, there's a ton published on Scrum, and there are many Scrum trainers and Scrum consultants available, so the industry support for Scrum is extensive, and I would say more so than for any other Agile practice. And it does a good job when you implement it with fidelity in its initial implementation of addressing lots of the issues that have traditionally been challenging for teamwork in a software context. So for lots of different reasons, Scrum is a good place to start. And it then forms a baseline for improvement. So not only is it a good place to get into Agile practices, it's also a good launching pad to become better and, in some sense, increasingly Agile once you get the basics down through Scrum. So, Scrum is kind of like learning to ride a bicycle before you learn to ride a motorcycle. You're probably not going to start as your first two-wheeled vehicle, riding Harley-Davidson. You're going to start on a bicycle, and I think probably is unfair to Scrum to compare it to a bicycle. I think it ends up being more powerful than that. But the idea is it gives you a chance to start small and work up from there.
So that's great. I think about the experiences that I've had with some of our clients where they've had misfires, and so you need to let the team drive through a certain number of sprints and practice and get better at what they're doing. I mean, how do you avoid tinkering with the process too much and let it settle out? What kind of guidance do you give to leaders that are overseeing a team and the team is stumbling a little bit?
I think that the idea of go forth and do Scrum doesn't seem to work very well. There are lots of YouTube videos and blog articles on Scrum. I think these are not sufficient, not necessary really, or sufficient for implementing Scrum. I think it's really helpful to have somebody who knows the ropes, who has experienced successful Scrum work, who is engaged with the team somehow. That person can be serving as Scrum Master on the team. That person can be serving as a coach that is working with the team. But yeah, Scrum is, I think Scrum is a fairly minimal process, but you really have to be doing all the pieces to make it work. And if you haven't done it before, it can be fairly tempting to just prune off some of the pieces and say, well, that doesn't make sense for us. Why would we do that? We'll skip that part and we'll skip this part. And without meaning to, you end up undermining the practice to a degree that it just doesn't really give you the benefit.
Right.
And I think one thing I really believe about Scrum is that it is designed in the first place as minimal process. It really does meet the definition of something is complete, not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away. And I really don't think that, at least in an initial implementation of Scrum, there's anything in there that you can take away. Now, as time goes by and a team gets spun up and super familiar with the workflow in Scrum and the practices in Scrum, then I think it's possible that the team can inspect and adapt and customize Scrum so that it works better for that team. But that's an advanced activity.
Sure.
That's not an introductory
Well,
activity.
there's typically maybe some external criteria that would force them to change that, right? Something is not happening with the way they collect inbound stories, or some different ways that things are presenting themselves to the team that they have to make adjustments on how to include things. Or maybe they have, in an Agile context, a bigger picture. Maybe they have a varied work stream where they do have some greenfield work they're working on, but they also have ad hoc work coming in. So an adjustment to a fundamental Scrum team that has to handle that interruptive work might be something they might think about, right?
I think those are individual examples of implementation challenges that Scrum teams see. I think the more general way that I would look at that is to go back to your question about why did I think there needed to be another book on Agile. And one of the features of my book is that it contains a several-page section on failure modes of Scrum.
Right.
And to me and to us here at Construx, this is not news. We've been seeing this, project after project, team after team for many years.
Yeah.
But to my surprise, when the book went out for peer review, people absolutely loved that section on the failure modes of Scrum. And I think that goes back to the idea that most books are written by evangelists, and they probably have seen the pitfalls that we've seen, but they don't, for some reason, I guess they don't want to talk about them. And so I don't think there's anything wrong. I think it's positive to talk about the ways that Scrum can fail, because overall it's a super positive practice and super useful. But if you're not aware of the failure modes, then maybe you'll run into one of them and give up thinking, okay, it doesn't work in our organization.
Right.
When really you're just running into a well-known and familiar problem that there's probably a well-known way to address. And so, this is another reason that I think the idea of just pointing teams at Scrum and saying, go forth and do Scrum is problematic, because a lot of times the teams will run into one of these failure modes and they won't know how to work around it. So I think the leader's job in this case is to make sure that the team has the right kind of support to persist through some initial obstacles. And a lot of organizations, you have an initial implementation that goes well, and then the second team to try something doesn't do as well as the first, and that first team often is motivated to work through the obstacles, or maybe that first team is seated with the people who already have experience, but then the second team doesn't have those advantages, and so the second teams and later end up needing more support.
So something like the diffusion of innovation model, right, where you have the initial teams that do something well, and then you start getting people who maybe aren't as interested, or they're more resistant, or
very much so. I think that when you look at the diffusion of innovation model, the innovators and the early adopters are highly risk tolerant. They are attracted to novelty for its own sake. They will exert substantial personal energy to overcome obstacles.
Right.
They don't see obstacles as obstacles. They see them as obstacles that other people probably won't overcome, but that they themselves are able to overcome, and so they'll get to that benefit sooner than other people. So the psychology of it is interesting, and then the later adopters, in fact, do see obstacles as obstacles and see them as evidence that the thing's not going to work, and use it as a reason to just stop. And so anyway, it all comes down to the leader's role here is to support the teams, recognize that your first team is probably more enthusiastic than any team that comes after, and perhaps also maybe better equipped within the internals of the team to be successful, and recognizing that different teams are different.
Right.
And not all problems mean that there's a problem with a technique. It's just basically the activity of fitting it into your teams and your organization.
Exactly. And we're going to talk in later podcasts about this notion of permission to fail, and the ability to let, and you look at subsequent teams that maybe don't perform quite as well as the first team through the process, and so that would probably be in that category of things we could touch on at that time.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and Agile is an empirical process. I think you could describe it as an experimental process, and one of the aspects of an experiment is not all experiments are successful.
Totally.
And if you hold out the condition that everything you try must be successful, then you are really limiting your ability to improve.
You're going to be shocked. You're going to be exactly.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the importance of having experienced players on a team helping to guide the team when they're first starting out, like solid players in the classic roles of Scrum, like product owners or Scrum masters. And that kind of leads us to key principle number 3. So let's talk about something that's important to these self-managed teams, and that has to do with everybody being involved in a team-level decision-making process. And we're often asked, in when we do new Scrum adoptions with organizations that have not tried it, they always ask us who should be in the training. And so we always recommend business analysts and devs and QA and testers and everybody really that on the team or touches the team. And so this notion of building cross-functional teams.
Right.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what that means and why that's so important?
Yeah, the notion of building cross-functional teams, I think, to my mind, really fits into the idea of trying to make the decision loop as tight as possible. And it really, in my mind, goes back to the Microsoft feature team idea published in Michael Cusimano's book in around 1991, Microsoft Secrets. And the idea of a cross-discipline team is that you have all the disciplines involved to make the vast majority of decisions. So you've got the business represented by the product owner, and ideally the developers also have some business sense, and I think it's
some
important.
Conversation, sure.
Important to develop business sense in the developers. You've got testers embedded in the team, or you've got developers taking on the role or the responsibility of testing. One way or another, you've got the test orientation present on the team. Obviously, you've got the development orientation present on the team. And then you've got the Scrum Master who is responsible for, among other things, Scrum process. And in some cases, that includes interfacing with other teams. And then, of course, the product owner brings the business awareness, but then also the requirements and potentially the requirements interfaces with other teams. And then various specialists. You might have architect on the team or a usability person on the team. You might have a database person on the team. And the point is that ideally, and a lot of times organizations struggle in a relatively small team of 7 to 9 people or 5 to 9 people to get all these disciplines represented on one team. But ideally, you rarely have to go outside the team to be able to make a decision that will be viewed by the organization, not just by the team, but by the overall organization as binding. And if you get the expertise on the team that can represent the vast majority of the organizational interests, then it becomes possible for the organization to meaningfully delegate responsibility for all that decision making to the team. And that then allows the team to move very quickly because you don't have the wait states of needing to go out and ask someone else for their input, or going out, and of course you're always asking others for their input, but you don't have the wait state of having to find somebody who can represent the interests of the business, or find someone who can represent the interests of test or usability or whatever the issue is. Most of the time they're right there, and you can get a decision very, very quickly. I think one of the pitfalls in this area is that this is another area where the leader can't just pick a bunch of people and assign them to a team and say, okay, go be self-directing and cross-discipline. The leader can certainly try to come up with a cross-discipline team, but it is a maturation process for the team to learn how to be self-directing and to become confident in making decisions themselves, and then developing an awareness of, well, when do we actually need to reach outside the team and get confirmation of our decision, and when don't we? So that's a process, and that can take months
to settle down.
And that's something where the leader really needs to be supportive of the team. And I like Andy Grove's notion from his book High Output Management of task relevant maturity, and I don't talk about that in More Effective Agile, but the notion of task relevant maturity just says that the degree to which, or the closeness to which you manage someone, is based not on them as a person overall or their overall seniority, but based on the maturity they have in the specific task they've been assigned to. So if their task relevant maturity is low, then you're going to manage them more closely and support them more closely. If their task relevant maturity is high, then you're going to back off and give them more rope.
Sure.
And so as you set up your cross-functional self-directing teams, early on their task relevant maturity in being a cross-functional self-directing team is going to be low, and they need more support. As time goes by, then you can back off.
Totally makes sense. I want to do a quick time check here. Are we okay with one more? Okay, great. We can do one more here. I mean, you touched on the idea of having testing as part of the equation, whether it's the developers doing the testing or test roles being part of these cross-functional teams. And a lot of the Agile teams that we work with struggle with this notion of test and the role of the classic over-the-wall tester, and that the fact that that's been dissolved to some extent from the traditional sequential development. I mean, we just had our software leadership summit, and one of the speakers polled the 70 attendees we had in the room if they still struggle with the tester role, and just about every single hand went up. Did that surprise you? That would still seem to be an issue after all these years of Agile adoption out in the marketplace?
No, it didn't surprise me at all, because the reason I invited that speaker to the summit was because I had gotten so much feedback on the book manuscript about tests still being a challenging area.
Right.
So I think this is one where we can just go back and kind of look at the history of test and apply some of what was happening when Agile started, bring that forward into Agile, and I think that explains a lot of why testing in Agile is difficult. So if we go back 15 to 20 years, I think we had already seen the pendulum swing from throwing code over the wall. There, of course, were still organizations that were doing that, but it was widely recognized among people who knew what they were talking about that the idea that throwing code over the wall and expecting tests to test quality in didn't work very well. So we already had pre-Agile a notion of collaborative relationship with test that developers would do most of the test work or most of the quality work themselves, that often testers would give developers their test suites that the developers would run individually before they checked code in and turned it over to test, where the expectation really was that the test wasn't going to find many errors because they were pushing their work upstream and collaborating with the developers. So then we got into, so that was basically happening in the late waterfall days. So then Agile started. We got Scrum emerging as the most popular Agile practice. We had Scrum's notion of testers being embedded in the teams, or the notion of test specialists, maybe went away or maybe it didn't. And I think, so what we end up with, though, is I think a lot of Scrum is written under the presumption, or a lot of the commentary on Scrum is written under the presumption that you mostly have developers and testing is kind of a secondary role. But if we go back 15 or 20 years, one of the interesting questions we used to talk about was, what is your ratio of testers to developers, or developers to testers? And what we had found we'd worked with many organizations, and at the time, the highest ratio we normally saw was one tester per developer. And a senior leader at Microsoft told me 20 years ago that was the wrong way to look at it. He said, really, the way to look at it is you have one person doing test automation who follows the developer, and that's the right way to look at it. So that one-to-one ratio is really just about the ratio of what it takes to do test automation.
Right.
So, but there were lots of companies that weren't doing any test automation, and a lot of this comes down to how complex and what level of reliability is required in the software. So if you have super high reliability software, you're probably going to have a ratio of something like one tester per developer. On the Space Shuttle flight control software, which is an extreme case, they had a ratio of 10 testers per developer. On medical device software, you can sometimes see ratios of 3-to-1 in terms of QA specialists, not just tests.
We all want that in our healthcare. So.
Yes, we do. But for common commercial systems that are widely used by the public, so broadly distributed systems, one-to-one ratio is typical. But once you get into in-house development, we would typically see ratios of more like 3 developers per tester, 5 developers per tester, and it was not uncommon to see 0 testers in the organization at all. Developers were totally responsible for their own tests, and the required reliability of the software just wasn't high enough that it needed that independent testing. So we take all that with this widely varying developer-tester ratios, and we fast forward into Scrum teams, and now we have the advice of, include the testers and developers on the same Scrum team. And so very naturally, you have a bunch of people saying, well, but, I've got a ratio of 1-to-1,
right.
Or I've got a ratio of, I didn't have any testers before. Am I supposed to have testers now? And so I think it's taken some years for that whole issue to settle out. And the confounding influence has been very high-profile move by Microsoft to get rid of the SDET role.
Yeah.
And I think that in practice they've backed off that. Well, in practice I don't think they ever really got rid of it. I think they changed titles, and then on the teams they still had lots of former testers who were now titled as developers, but were still mainly focused on tests.
Exactly.
So on the ground, I think that behavior changed less. But so anyway, I think we end up with test has always been a little bit of a thorny issue, and it ends up becoming very specialized to each individual organization. And so general advice in industry literature tends to miss the mark for any individual organization because it assumes a level of need for QA and tests that may or may not be applicable to any given case. But this is one of those areas where the fact that we work with so many different kinds of companies, we work with medical device companies, we work with premise software companies, we work with companies that are just developing in-house systems for in-house use.
Exactly.
And the ratios of kinds of staff vary wildly across these different kinds of software. And that's true in Agile just as it was true 20 years ago.
But I mean, it's kind of funny. We're summarizing the fourth principle, which is really integrate testers into development teams. The idea, though, I think is you're spot on. Is you just want to tighten the feedback loop between the development and tests, and having people doing the tests and the people who write the code be closer in alignment and closer together.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things about Agile has been pushing tests forward so that in some cases, in all cases, we are testing at least immediately after we write the code, and in some cases we're writing the tests before we write the code.
Test-driven development.
For test-driven development.
Right.
I mean, I think the key principle there is tighten the feedback loop, and either you can tighten the feedback loop by writing the tests immediately after you write the code or before. I think those are both very tight feedback loops. The thing we're trying to avoid is writing the code and then 2 weeks later or 2 months later somebody starts writing tests against it. Then we have a really elongated feedback loop that is just an invitation for errors to creep in and hard to find, hard to fix, hard to remember errors.
But I mean, I think the idea of having folks in the team being that tightly coupled, in a traditional sense, with a tester was in a classic role, they were required to do automation aspects of what they're doing. And if you have the developers taking on some role at the front end, whether TDD or whatnot, then maybe it's an advantage and a utilization improvement to have those testers in the classic role now concentrate more on automation on the back end.
I think one of the trends in Agile development that has not received much attention online or in the literature is the role that system test plays. And I think if you read the Agile literature, even very current online stuff, it would be really easy to get the impression that system testing has gone away.
Right.
And at this year's Leadership Summit, which we just finished in mid-November, I think it was really clear that system test was nearly universally still present in organizations. And it might be smaller than it used to be because some of the people who would have been organized into system test are now not doing system test. They're embedded in the teams. But it was really striking to me that I think this is another pendulum swing where organizations still see value in having system tests that goes beyond the tests that developers are going to write iteration by iteration.
Well, in some respects, the rise of CI/CD DevOps kind of activities is probably somewhat responsible for that system test, because you still are trying to push out. If you're trying to push out something on a continuous basis, then you sure as hell better be doing some kind of system level testing.
Well, yeah, I think that's part of it. I don't know that I would lay it really at the feet of CI/CD. I think it has more to do with the reliability requirements and anybody who's developing software that their business depends on, whether it's because it's software they sell or because it's software that enables hardware device or adds functionality to a hardware device, or just software that is exists as the front end of the business, like software as a service. The reliability required for that is high, and there are issues that come up in the software that's developed for those purposes tends to be software that's developed by multiple teams, and even if each team individually is thoroughly testing its own work, the whole notion of system test is to test interactions that maybe individual teams may be oblivious to.
Absolutely.
And despite best intentions, it's not a matter of teams being careless or even lacking expertise. It's just their focus is on their stuff, as it should be. And it's useful to have somebody whose focus is on all this stuff, not just anybody's individual piece.
That makes total sense. I think that's going to be all for today. I think I'm getting the hook from our producer over in the corner here. But Steve, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a really rewarding conversation. I enjoyed it. I'm glad that you are through your first podcast and everything was successful. Hopefully, engineer, right? We got everything. It's in the can.
Thank you, Mark. It's my pleasure. And next time I will be sure to bring some plant photos and we can relive old times.
Good. We look forward to you coming back in the
identification.
future. All right, that's all the time we have today. Be sure to tune in again for another edition of Inspect and Adapt, the Construx podcast. Until then, this has been Mark Griffin, your host. Cody Madison has been our sound engineer, and Devin Musgrave is our producer. Have a great next sprint. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to give us a positive rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you found us. If you have comments or would like to talk to one of our practitioners, or you have ideas for a future podcast, reach out via email using comments@construx.com. Again, that's comments@construx.com. We'd love to hear from you.